I'm going to kind of follow on from the way the last panel was run, but I want to start by literally welcoming the four wahine toa. This panel is very specifically focusing around Te Tiriti o Waitangi, but we've already had throughout the day, and we will have tomorrow as well, a theme that if we are to do things differently in Aotearoa, this has to be at the core. And that was the challenge that Ngāti Whātua presented this morning as well. And so we will push those boundaries a little bit further now. And what I'm going to do is to start with a question and a follow-up question for each of the panel, and then they may want to make a comment in response to each other, and then we'll see what we evoke from the floor or from Twitter. We're going to start off with Margaret Mutu, and Margaret was, along with Moana Jackson, the co-author, co-coordinator of the Matike Mai report of a constitutional consultation amongst Māori as to what constitutional change should look like. And so I wanted to start with Margaret and say, you know, what for you would be a treaty-compliant approach to how we should address these kinds of challenges with these agreements, negotiations, and international relationships?
Ai, tēnā rā tātou. Te mea tūtahi me mihi atu ki a koutou te mana whenua, rā ki a koe a mokura, Ngāti Whātua ki o rākei. Ki a koutou katoa ko tai mai I tēnei wā, ki a koutou ngā hoa, no Ngāti Raukaua, no Ngāti Pikiao. Anō reira ngā mihi. Thank you for asking me to do this, Jane, but for me, if I'm going to comment on this stuff, first of all, most of the work that was done on constitutional transformation, one is very clear, it's not change, it's transformation. Got to unpick things and start again. That work was done mainly by Moana, in that he called together 252 hui around the country in order to determine exactly what it would take for Māori to be able to live in a country in a way that was relevant to them, and so that Māori no longer lived at the margins of this country that is, in fact, ours. So, first of all, the main thing was that our people, wherever we went, I did go to about 60 of those hui, so I have a fair idea. And as I say, the drafting of that report was mainly Moana. I did a little bit of it, but Moana did the bulk of it. It's very, very clear that for our people, the existing constitutional arrangements in this country do not work, and there has to be fundamental change. And that fundamental change goes back to the agreements that were struck back in 1840 and the declaration that was issued in 1835 that said very, very clearly where power and authority, we call it mana, in British terms you call it sovereignty, where it lies in this country, and it lies with the hapu, not with the iwi, not with the collective of groups of extended families, but with the hapu, the economic units of Māoridom. That's where it lies. And hapu have never, ever ceded that. And to this day, they still consider they have it. Some, particularly those of us who live in very remote areas, still exercise that. So, and we do it, hey, I'm talking about my own hapu. We do it like this. Any government or local government official or person who wants to come onto our territory can't come without our permission. And if they do come, it's because we ask them and they have a specific task they will do, and once that's done, they're gone. For us, in my hapu, we make our own decisions about our own lives on our own land. It makes no difference to us whether the government says, but you don't own that land. It has title over it that says somebody else owns it. We're remote enough, so you'd never get away with this in Tāmaki Makaurau. We're remote enough that we can just say, you can tell as many lies you like and write down as many lies on pieces of paper that you call title to land, but we know that that land is ours, and we will take over and take back our lands. We don't call it occupation, we call it repossession. And we try to build our own economy, and we will trade with whom we wish to trade. And so at the moment, my hapu is setting up a relationship. We do things differently when we trade. We set up relationships first, and we decide whether it is these sorts of people that we want to work with. And at the moment, we are working with a very large, very capitalist organised company in China. But they have a similar thinking to ours, and they also know, because we said so right at the beginning, when you come in here, you come into our territory, you come into our land. We have our own rules, you are our guest, please live by our rules. We will decide what those rules are, not the New Zealand government. This is the sort of thing that we were told as we went round the country asking about what transformation needed to be made to the constitutional arrangements in this country. And so the report was written largely by Moana. It looks at, one, the fact that the constitutional arrangements currently are failing, but don't concentrate on that, concentrate on how are you going to live and conduct yourselves in a way that doesn't perpetuate that situation, does not perpetuate the poverty that our people are forced to live under, that we will take back control of our lives. And so you will see in the report that Moana talks about creating a future environment where Māori are fully recognised and respected in this country for who we are. We are the mana whenua. We are the power and authority in this country. We are the ones who are ultimately responsible for the well-being of this country and everybody in it. But that hasn't been recognised. But we will continue to operate as if it has, within my hapu anyway. And that tikanga, our laws that were here long before anybody else came, mātauranga Māori, our knowledge systems, e hakaputanga, the 1835 declaration of the location of mana, sovereignty in our hapu, and te tiriti are all a natural part of the order of this country, and that there is no debate about this, it's just the way it is. And you walk your talk on this stuff. And as a result of that, hapu and iwi exercise their own mana. Now, as we find in my hapu, when you exercise your own mana, that includes taking on responsibility for everything that's good and everything that's bad as well. But you are responsible for your own well-being. All peoples have a respected constitutional place in this country. Now that is something that came to disturb me more and more as we went round the country. That it is not just Māori who are marginalised in this country. There are a lot of other people who are marginalised. So when we finished the report and took it out around the country, we got asked, particularly by people who are not of European descent, whether they could please be a part of the Māori part of the constitutional makeup we were talking about. The models that we ended up putting up meant that the Crown would stay where it is and look after its people, probably with its own parliament and what have you. But that Māori would look after our own area of influence. We got this sphere of influence out of the Waitangi Tribunal. We would look after our own sphere of influence under our own tikanga, under our own ways of being, and they would be quite independent of the Crown's, and the Crown would no longer have any right to have any say over Māori matters, because it was not allowed for in Te Tiriti, and certainly wasn't allowed for under He Hakaputanga. So the way the government operates at the moment is quite illegitimate. We want that put to way. So this, when people came and asked us, can we please be part of you? We said, well, provided you want to live under our tikanga, fine. And then what disturbed me even more was a whole lot of Pākehā came and asked if they could be part of that as well. And I said, well, fine, if you want to be part of our tikanga and live by our tikanga, that's up to you. Just remember you've got the Crown over there as well. But the thing is, they've got to learn to talk to each other and talk to each other properly. And that the constitution that does get put in place must be for good, just and participatory government for and by all people, not just a privileged few, which is what you have at the moment. And that it's consistent with the values that we do talk about in the report and you're going to talk about here, and that it benefits everybody. And this is part of the underlying value system that Māoridom has. If some do not benefit, then your system is failing. And that at the end of the day, all New Zealanders prosper and celebrate the heritage of what we have, not just those who can derive monetary benefit. I often wonder where they sit spiritually, because that's the thing that gets sacrificed with all this capitalism and neoliberalism. Okay, that'll do for now.
You had a hand in it too, girl. To pick up on Michael's little technique, I mean, what was coming to me was, who are the rule makers and who are the rule breakers? And the rule makers are actually usurping the role of the real rule makers, but turn you into rule breakers under these agreements. And we're waiting to see when the first one comes up, because there is a presumption that you can't develop your own relationships. And so I wanted to pick up on from Ani Mikaere, who we were having a chat on the phone the other night, because Ani used to teach at a law school, and then she saw the light and went to work at Te Wānanga o Raukawa, and teaches Māori law. And we were talking not only about what the principles of tikanga might be that might underpin a different way of doing these kinds of relationships, but also about how transformation might occur. And in particular, the really different model of thinking about law as a tikanga-based way of doing relationships. And so, Ani, would you like to pick up on that theme?
Kia ora, Jane. I te tuatahi me mihia ka tika te iwi kāinga. Nō reira Ngāti Whātua ki ora kei, tēnā koutou. Tēnā hoki koe e hoa, nāu tā tātou hui I whakarite. Tēnā koe. Yeah, Jane and I did have a quick chat the other day on the phone. And I just wondered, she's kind of given me this area to cover talking about tikanga and values, or what we would probably call kaupapa. And I can only really come to that topic from my own experience as someone who's part of Ngāti Raukawa, belongs to Ngāti Raukawa, and we have a particular history that most of you here won't know, it's a long way away, but also as someone who's worked at Te Wānanga o Raukawa for a number of years. And when I was going to try to describe for you Te Wānanga o Raukawa, the kind of organisation that we are, we're an organisation that strives to be a tikanga-based organisation. And at first glance, that might seem a little odd. Why would we have to strive to be that? Because surely it would come naturally to us, wouldn't it? Something like 98% of our staff are Māori. Probably a similar percentage of students are Māori. We teach tikanga Māori, te reo Māori. So you'd think it would come naturally for us to be a tikanga-based institution. But in fact, after nearly 200 years of being educated and cajoled and bullied and told that we should behave differently, we've had to face a kind of slightly unpleasant truth, is that our default setting is probably not tikanga anymore, it's actually more like the law of the coloniser. So if we want to be a tikanga-based institution, what our tūpuna used to do automatically, we now have to be quite deliberate and quite careful about doing. And the reason I said to Jane is I kind of wondered aloud whether our experience of the past sort of 30, 40 years might be relevant to the discussion today, is the sense I get is that for many people now there's a certain way of going about doing trade and doing business, a certain way of operating has become normalised. And as I understand what this hui is trying to do is that we're trying to create a new normal, a different normal, a completely different approach. And so it seems to me that within Ngāti Raukawa and within Te Wānanga o Raukawa, we know something about trying to change our default setting, I call it. And I think here perhaps you're trying to change a default setting in terms of what trade looks like. So I thought maybe it would be useful to talk about that experience a little bit. The way that when I've thought back on our experience, there are certain things that we had to do to make the transformation possible. And particularly in the panel before this one, I could hear some of the things coming through that sounded familiar to me. So one of the first things that we did was we came up with a vision, a clear vision of what we wanted. And then the time had to be taken to ensure that that vision was widely shared. So when I hear about te ohu whakawhanaunga, it sounds like that's the kind of process that's going on there. Once you had a widely shared vision, then we committed to some fundamental principles that would underpin the way that we would operate. And then we had to figure out how we would create tikanga, or practices, that would express those fundamental principles, or kaupapa. Now the practices can change over time, but the kaupapa, or the fundamental principles, we've found actually don't. I mean, they might in future, but so far the principles we've come up with have stood us in really good stead. So the tikanga can change from time to time, the principles don't. But we also need to be really willing to constantly review ourselves to make sure that we're not going back to the old default settings. We have to be prepared to call one another out if we think we are going back to the old default settings. And we have to be, it's a process it's not for the faint-hearted, but it's something that can be achieved. And what I would say is, where I'm from, we've been on a journey really for about the last 40 years, back from the brink of what some people might call cultural extinction, really. And I wouldn't say that we're perfect, not by a long shot. I wouldn't say we've come close to achieving our goals yet, but we have made progress, and it's really because that was the process that we went through. So yeah, it was great to hear some of the panellists in the last session talking about that building that shared vision and getting people to be committed to it, and then the next steps will be coming up with those principles. So at Te Wānanga o Raukawa, we've come up with a magic figure of 10 principles or kaupapa. They underpin everything that we do. And we take it really seriously. If we're doing something and we can't explain how this particular practice is expressing a kaupapa, then that practice can't fly, and we actually have to stop doing it. We do take it very seriously. I don't know if I have time to talk about some of the kaupapa or the principles. Do I have time?
Yeah, a couple, and then we can have some.
Okay, so one of them, I'll throw a multi-headed one, that's where I get a whole lot in for the price of one. So rangatiratanga is one of our kaupapa, and rangatiratanga it's about authority, but more importantly, it's about how authority is exercised. So about 20 years ago, Bishop Manuhuia Bennett had this wonderful series of statements about the characteristics of a rangatira. So te kai a te rangatira, he kōrero. The food of a rangatira is talk. Now that doesn't just mean that leaders are eloquent, although they often are. They know the power of the word to persuade, to encourage, whatever. More importantly, a rangatira keeps their word. So if you say something, you keep to that. So that's actually about integrity. So rangatiratanga, that authority, it has to be about honesty and integrity. The second part of his kōrero was te tohe o te rangatira he manaaki. The mark of a rangatira is the ability to look after people. And for that, that's about actually acknowledging and respecting everyone around you, enhancing the mana. Manaakitanga is literally to enhance the mana of those around you. And it's to understand that mana isn't a finite resource. It's not so if Annette and I are in a relationship, the more mana she has, the less I have. That's not how it works. I am expected to behave in a way that respects Annette, enhances her mana, and in doing that, I actually enhance my own. So it's a win-win. So that's kind of the second idea about rangatiratanga authority. You behave in a way that respects, uplifts other people, and in so doing, you actually uplift yourself. And the third and final part of rangatiratanga is te mahi a te rangatira, he whakatira i te iwi, and that's about kotahitanga, that's about social cohesion. So you exercise your authority in a way that pulls people together, that makes people collectively strong. So there are a whole lot of others, but that will probably do for now. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Ani. And what was striking me then, following on from Margaret, was that when we talk to officials or when we are in this other strange zone of these agreements and so on, it's as if there is not only no conceivable alternative, but no alternative that actually is viable and can happen. And you have both been talking about realities that are working today, that are living alternatives in this place, but they're invisible in that other zone. So my wonderful colleague Amakura, who was is a technical, academic, intellectual expert in the investment side of this stuff, but was also the expert for the Waitangi Tribunal itself in the claim on the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. And your whanaunga this morning were just wonderful. Well, no, I mean, they set the kaupapa. They set the kaupapa perfectly, yeah? And so what I wanted to ask first was just, out of that experience in the tribunal, what do you think were the main challenges that emerged out of that process that need to be confronted before we can have this kind of discussion that Ani and Margaret have talked about?
Oh, kia ora, Jane. Well, maybe I'll just pick up on what Ani and Margaret were saying. So, as you said, I went into that hearing because I was cajoled by you. And
her.
And her. But as an expert on international investment law, you know, I haven't spent much time on mātauranga Māori or any of those things. I'm a commercial lawyer. But my observation, one of my first observations was just, so talking about tino rangatiratanga was the assumption, the Crown just assumed that because it was the state, you know, it had the sovereign authority to negotiate these agreements on behalf of everybody, and it just didn't acknowledge the you know, the rangatiratanga of Māori, and it was incredibly frustrating to watch all the claimants trying to say, but we're Māori and this is about the treaty. And the response of the Crown was the constant refrain, well, you don't really have any interests in these agreements, and we tried to consult with you, as if consultation was, you know, sufficient. So, and I don't know what the answer to that is, but the starting point would be to acknowledge, to actually acknowledge that tino rangatiratanga and to change the way the Crown sees itself externally, you know, as you know, rather than this notion of the unitary state. It just doesn't work. It doesn't work, and it in itself is not really compliant. Well, it's just not compliant with the treaty. So, in other words, the Crown's view of where the treaty fits in all of this is a very low level kind of interest, if it exists at all. You know, so even before you get on to the economic discussion and how you might lift up Māori economic performance and participate in these agreements, there's that sort of fundamental statehood issue that we all need to confront. What else did I see in terms of challenges? Well, the agreements that we have at the moment are simply not set up to acknowledge the kinds of economic interests, social interests that Māori have. You know, so except to the extent that Māori participate in the economy on the same footing and in the same way as Pākehā businesses do. You know? So that's an issue. So these agreements, the agreements that we currently have, and this dates all the way, you know, from the current, well, the most recent one, the CPTPP, all the way back to the original ones, they're just not set up for the kind of interests that we're likely to have. And so we have, so then the other challenge, and you know, my role in the tribunal process was really to have a look at the effectiveness of the protective mechanism. So there's a provision in all of these agreements which is meant to protect Māori interests. That's about the extent of the recognition of Māori interests in these agreements. It's how do we protect Māori interests, you know, the defensive interests. And the protection in itself is not good enough, but that's perhaps something that we can talk about later. So I guess, you know, just in broad terms, without getting into specifics, you've got the sort of constitutional statehood issues to look at, and then also the, you know, what interests do Māori have that can be promoted through these agreements? And then we also have to fix the protective mechanisms as well. General reflections.
Yeah, and the question then is, how do you move from one to t'other?
Vote you into Parliament, I don't know. Well, recognising what those interests are. So if I use the example of investment, because it's the one that I'm most familiar with, the idea of these trade agreements is to encourage foreign investment. You know, so more foreign investment into New Zealand and more New Zealand foreign investment overseas. So the positive economic interests would be, you know, if Māori are foreign investors investing offshore, and having foreign investment in Māori enterprises, you know, in New Zealand. And these agreements do that by, you know, facilitating market access, so making it easier for foreigners to come here and making it easier for New Zealanders to go elsewhere, and then protecting the investments once they're made. There's no, so in terms of trying to facilitate Māori benefit in these agreements, then those are general economic policies. We actually just need to get Māori active in the economy if that's what we want to do. And then we need to adjust the agreements to take into account or to reflect the particular kind of economic participation that we want. So that's an adjustment. And then in terms of the protective side of things, so we protect foreign investments. One of the things that foreign investors do not like is regulatory change, because, you know, that creates risk and uncertainty, and, you know, foreign investors typically just don't like that. So these agreements are geared to promote regulatory stability. It's an issue for the treaty specifically, because we're just so far away from actually achieving, you know, good regulation in New Zealand from a treaty perspective. So we need to change a lot. So these agreements also need to accommodate the kind of regulatory transformation that we need in New Zealand. So again, just in broad and general terms, those are the kinds of things that we should be looking at.
Yeah, one of the interesting novelties that's emerged that raises the question about what kind of relationships do you want, even in the foreign investment terms, is say what Brazil has done with its new model. And when I talked to them there about, and including the investors, as to why they had done this, they said, we want long-term relationships with the countries we're in. We don't want to just go in there and plunder them, despite the fact that the Brazilian oil exploration may have been seen as such. But we're not interested in having rights that we can sue the host state and bankrupt their taxpayers. We actually want to build relationships and find a way to do that through a different kind of model. And I think we may be, by no ISDS here, if the government is serious about, and we have yet to see, because there's not an agreement yet that has actually delivered on that, not having investors to sue, are we actually prepared to rethink beyond that the model of the kind of relationships we want and how to empower Māori in that process and how to make it a tikanga-based approach rather than a market liberal?
Yeah, and maybe I'll just pick up again on what Margaret was talking about in terms of the relationships that they're developing with, Chinese people up north. So we're far more, Māori are far more likely to want to have relationships with foreign investors and invest in those relationships rather than have random people coming and waving their checkbooks around. And ISDS, I imagine, is not part of that. So talking about a tikanga approach to doing business, the relationship comes first, trust. We don't talk about rights and protecting the rights and suing the government because they've changed the law. And so it's just it's a completely different view of what good foreign investment looks like.
So to Annette. At the end of the, phase 1 of the tribunal, because we've still got phase 2 of the tribunal to go, what were your takeaways when we got to the end of that phase about what are the key issues before we get on to what has or hasn't happened with them?
Kia ora, kei te tautoko au I ngā mihi ki o ngā si whātua, ngā tangata whenua pupuri te mauri o tēnei whenua rangatira mō tātou, kei te tautoko hoki I ngā mihi ki ngā wāhine tohunga e mau ana hoki I te whakahaere o tēnei tuāhuatanga mō te ao Māori. Koutou katoa I Wainganui, Tānia, Aroha tātou katoa, he tino kaupapa tērā ma tātou ngā wāhine Māori I tēnei ao hurihuri. Jane, I just want to follow on from what Amakura was saying. I came away from that with the recognition that while the clauses may have been reasonable when they were inserted at the time of the Singapore Free Trade Agreement, they're not effective in terms of protection. So I came away with that. I came away with the recognition perhaps by the tribunal that the Crown's assumption that they can develop relationship agreements and to assert a sovereignty over the authority that Māori possess is not right in 21st century Aotearoa, just as it was not right during the New Zealand Wars. And that was recognised by the tribunal. And the third thing that I also came around is that I think Māori are actually ahead of other general citizens on things like whakapapa protection, on the desire for, I think in the commercial terms it's trademarking or patenting our things, but it's actually protecting our taonga. And that the injustice of the way that foreign investors or corporate entities or multinationals are being given a special status over ordinary citizens and Māori as a general community is quite wrong. And the tribunal recognised that, but didn't have the time to grapple with how we might fix that up, which is where we go to in stage 2. The disappointing thing about it is that, this latest challenge to TPPA is part of a 30-year challenge that I've been part of for Y262. And so notwithstanding a 10-year process back then, which was led by great leaders of ours who've now passed on, there is this inability of the bureaucracy of this nation to deal with issues that have been right before them for 30 years. And it's a deliberate decision on their part to ignore it. But while they're ignoring it, I think Margaret and Ani have identified what Māori are doing. We're ignoring them, and we're developing and reframing and recapturing our own systems of authority and protection that are going to guide the nation. I mean, I look at the forestry stuff that was being discussed this morning. I mean, even Te Arawawhauma aren't into this nonsense of just planting trees and exporting them anymore. That's not an option for protection of our lands. It might be a short-term capital gain, but it has no benefit to the sustainability of our environment, which is an integral obligation of us that live on these lands. And I think that had to be recognised in the slush fund for the New Zealand First at the moment, because they've had to look at ways to develop those lands that protect those environmental obligations which are paramount to any commercial objective. So that's what's happening in that environment. I mean, I was listening to Margaret Kawharu about all these billions of dollars we're meant to have, and I actually resonated more with Tania Pauwhare this morning about, those $1 billion aren't trickling down to the Māori that I mix with. I'm in court every day with the average $16,000 a year person, most of whom are ending up in jail. One Māori person a day from Rotorua District Court goes to jail. And so at the same time as we've had these billions of dollars injected into the Central North Island through the CNI investment and settlement, there has been no change but a threefold increase in the social deprivation indicators. So it doesn't make sense to me. Foreign investment hasn't worked for us, and repossession of those commercial opportunities isn't working for the average Māori. So that disjuncture, which I do say is part of the systemic problems of free trade, has to be confronted, and Māori are confronting it. We've already started, as Margaret said, developing our own relationships, but they're with Indigenous people too. That's the other thing I think. So the word foreign is a little bit problem for me when we have foreign investors, because I don't see Indigenous investors necessarily foreign to the values that I uphold. So the language of foreign and nation and who's the citizens, I think the language needs to be challenged around that stuff as well. So that's what I came out of it. I don't think the tribunal is ready for stage 2. I think the Labour Party, New Zealand First Green Coalition has helped them a little bit with the ISDS, because that was a trouble for them. But, like you say, Jane, I'm still sceptical. I've yet to see anything actually have that written in it. And until it does, given the last 30 years' experience with the Crown, I won't believe it until I see it.
So when Wayne was talking before about the Indigenous chapter that was being negotiated, obviously in the NAFTA, but didn't come about, and then in the Pacific Alliance discussions, and that there have been discussions by the New Zealand negotiators with them. What was we had a quick chat about it before, and I just like you to reflect a little on that for others.
Just so you know, one of the key outstanding issues since Y262 is that there is no effective Māori engagement process with either the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, MB, or any other nominated Crown entity. And that has been a huge issue. And so now it seems they've bypassed us because they tended to have consultation amongst themselves. Their idea of consultation was in fact talking to representatives from TPK. Māori they might be, but they're both the Crown. Well, now they've decided, okay, the Waitangi Tribunal has said we've got to develop better engagement with Māori communities. Well, they've invisibilised us, and it seems like they've gone to our Indigenous cousins in Canada directly, which I find quite insulting, Wayne, to be frank. Both that Canadian Indigenous peoples have even thought they could represent a Māori position on this to the government, but more fundamentally that the government has bypassed any direct process of building an engagement model, of directly involving the keepers of Māori taonga in that engagement, and are now going to say that, yes, NAFTA's got this new clause, we've talked to the Indigenous communities in Canada how that clause got in, and we're going to have Trudeau's model built here. That again is the kind of cultural arrogance and ignorance that we rally against. And if it's going to be perpetuated under the current government, will no doubt be the fundamental challenge in the next phase of this. You know, iwi leaders have been asking for our people to construct democratically elected representatives. And we should be supporting that. We need national and regional hui where we nominate our own people and they set up the process of engagement. My problem with iwi leaders is they don't do the democratic part. They self-appoint too much at the moment, so we just need to build those participatory processes amongst our communities ourselves. But that's not for the government to do, that's for us to do. But the government has got to recognise they can't bypass Māori, certainly not in 21st century, for all the reasons that you've heard today. We're actually quite rich now, you know what I mean? But we also, the silver bullet, Tanya, some of us are still those silver bullets. We're not frightened to protest. We're certainly not frightened to challenge. And in terms of this, you know, it's big hitters. It's the New Zealand Māori Council. It's the Iwi Leaders Forum. And it is the activists that still lead these charges. So when things like this social injustice that we've talked about today happen, we will be the first ones to lead the charge, and our battles will start in the streets, in the courtrooms, and we will make change. I'm very clear on that.
You almost reminded me of that notorious press conference about the forests and the bridges.
I have to worry when I'm with Jane. I tend to get charged with sedition after these meetings, you know. And then I have really good friends from the Law Society come and protect me and say it was all Jane Kelsey's fault.
So, Margaret, would you like to kind of, you started the conversation off, would you like to reflect a bit and then we'll take a couple of comments from the floor?
First of all, just to pick up on a point that Annette was making, we have not been consulted in any way, shape or form on any of this, and I'm quite surprised at the comments that you made on that. And I'm one of these, for my sins, I am a member of National Iwi Chairs Forum. So I know what's going on in there, and I know they won't come and talk to us. So, and yeah, I'm not responsible for half of what my fellow members of National Iwi Chairs Forum do either. I spend half my time going in that forum. It is clear to me that Māori throughout the country, and especially when we were doing the constitutional transformation work, we have to take back control of our lives, and we're going to do it in every forum that we need to do that. A lot of our people, as Ani is saying, are a bit scared. We've been in this colonised space for quite some time, and they have to actually build confidence to know that they can make their own decisions. So Tanya, the sort of work that you're doing is fundamentally important, to give our people the space to get back that confidence to say you do not have to be constantly slaves. I did like that question about the importance of leisure, because for my hapu at home, my nieces and nephews who refuse to keep paying rent and go home, and to hell with the local council about resource consents and everything else. We just build, and I only hope the houses don't fall down, we build our own places to live in, and we make our own lives work. And we go here and there and do our bit of work to get a bit of money, but we're actually back with our whānau, living life the way we knew about, and that we're about 2 generations away from when it was actually done in practice. But there are enough of us still around to say, and this is what a communal garden looks like, and this is how you need to be looking after the mokopuna, and so when the big investors come from overseas, we're not scared of them, because that is still part of who we are, provided they don't run roughshod over us. Now, the first lot who came out there in Karikari Peninsula was an American. Now, we ended up dragging him through the courts up to the Supreme Court because we actually had the expertise within our whānau to know how to do that. Now, he got the hell out of there and sold to the Chinese. The Chinese were a totally different kettle of fish. They were about this particular Chinese company. Please, I do not speak for all China. This one particular company was more concerned with relationships. Now, we can relate to that. If we hadn't been able to relate to that, we would have fought them the same way we fought the American. So what I'm hearing here is our people will get there, but we can't do it immediately and tomorrow, and we need to give our people back the confidence. And I think we need to give the country back the confidence, from what I'm hearing from the rest of you. Give the country the confidence that you can actually make your own decisions for yourselves, and not let those bureaucrats in Wellington do that. Somebody was being generous about bureaucrats in Wellington, I'm not.
Well, and it's keeping the space open for those things to be able to happen without the cost being too high of the fight. We have 5 minutes left, and
thank you, Jane. Kia ora, and thank you, Wahine Toa, for your very informative contributions this afternoon. My question is about the New Zealand Super Fund. It's worth $40 billion. $5 billion of it only is invested in New Zealand, and I've heard your kōrero about taking control and challenging Crown entities, and I'm wondering if that's in your sights too, or that we can assist with that in your sights.
It's certainly been the subject of discussion in Waitangi Tribunal hearings that I've been in. They've challenged certainly the parameters of the kinds of investments they've made, not so much the quantum that's invested in New Zealand, but they have been actively challenging any suggestions of investments that aren't ethical in terms of treaty obligations. I agree with you, though, that we should be utilising that fund more focused to the citizens of this country and the relationships that will build, the social entrepreneurship that we need, but also the rangatiratanga reclamation processes that we need. One of my concerns, like planting more pine trees, is I just can't see how that's actually going to be good for us in the long term with climate change. I'd much like to see more work done in Indigenous forests, reclamation, a clean-up fund for our rivers, that kind of investment, that kind of social investment. And can I say, in the current water case, all of those things are being talked about, and it's in that context that I've heard the Super Fund talked about, how we would fund a clean-up fund and that kind of investment. But no specific challenge to the fund itself.
I'm just looking at the clock over there. No? Is there one more? Is it around the trade and investment kind of thingy?
Kia ora whānau. I respect the majority of the conversation, or the kōrero, has been around tangata whenua. I'm a trade union organiser, so each day I'm out trying to improve people's lives against what's the corporate hegemony. I'm interested to get a response around your focus on te tangata, on the people. How do the people benefit from your approach? How does their lives improve through the focus and direction that you're taking? And I think it's a great conversation to have.
I think, well, the suggestions I were making, and they were very broad and general, ones would likely see a de-emphasis on the large multinational corporations that currently benefit from the current style of trade agreements that we have. The set up, as I was trying to explain, they're not set up to look after local interests. They're set up to facilitate the kind of foreign investment that travels around the globe, and we want it to hit down in New Zealand. They tend to be large corporates that can afford to do that. So that's, so if we shift the focus of the agreements and what we want to achieve out of them, then we will probably end up shifting somewhat the kinds of people who benefit from them. I can't be more specific than that because I didn't give a concrete proposal.
Can I give you some examples? So you heard the Miraka one this morning. So they've got some standards of environmental, but they've also got some employment standards, like maintaining employment by owners or beneficiaries. But living wage is already written into those employment agreements. So for people working either in the dairy industry. But can I say also that some of the trusts that are investing in Miraka have broad, what I think would be equivalent to statement of corporate intents of corporates, which are about things like ensuring the footprint of what they do. Climate change, for instance, requires them, if they're going to have a dairy farm, to either convert that dairy farm to flowers or to actually have something to counteract that. And in terms of workers, making sure that in that process of change, transformation, that there are appropriate relationships set in place so that workers don't lose their jobs. That's one of the, I come from Kawerau, from Murupara. The last transformation, which was the sell-off, made all of those areas ghost towns. And so one of the things that people are talking about is how bring that back. I'm presently in the Waitangi Tribunal fighting for Māori nurses, because in the whānau order space, the public-private partnerships that are being developed do not guarantee living wage for the nurses, and see disparities between those that work for DHBs and whānau orders, sometimes as much as $10 an hour for workers, and that's got to stop. So, just saying that in this space, Māori development are very conscious of workers, because we were the brunt of what the free trade experiment, I think they called them structural adjustment programs this morning, have done for us. We're trying to work to overcome that. The other reality is we're still the greater proportion of unemployed groups in rural areas, and we need to have the unemployed. That's why I like the question about work, because our marae will die if we didn't have people there that actually work. We just don't get paid for the work we do, but those people are the backbone of our culture. So one of the experiments that Ani might talk about is how Wānanga Raukawa has built that social infrastructure to ensure the survival of their te reo me ona tikanga.
I probably don't have time to talk about that now, but just a quick answer to your question though is, if you get the principles right, and I didn't manage to cover most of them, but if you get the principles right, and if you get a commitment that everything you do has to tie back to those principles, then people will be looked after. I mean, in 100 different ways, which I can't go into now because we're out of time, but But you really got to start with that shared vision and the shared commitment, and the rest actually does follow. It sounds kind of a bit cheesy and simple. It's not, it's actually bloody hard work, but you have to do that first.
And I think the key thing is about giving back people the power over their own lives, make their own decisions, and to do things that are relevant to them instead of being, as so many of our people are, slaves to people whom they never see the benefit of it. The work has to be relevant. The work has to benefit our people. And that's where our people will start to get back the confidence so that they can control their own lives. I mean, the need for us to have our marae is just fundamentally important. And yet I see no provision for the upkeep of our marae. We do it all pinching and scraping and all that sort of thing. We've got to stop doing that sort of thing. Our marae are the centre of our lives. And that's where we need to be.
Makura is going to do a tiny little bit,
Really
and then I'm
tiny.
going to talk about the ongoing conversation.
Yeah, just to give you a specific example, because I've been talking about generalities, and just because corporate social responsibility was mentioned a minute ago. So if we have a look at a current trade agreement like the CPTPP, there is a provision in the investment chapter which says we urge the state parties to consider, the voluntary adherence with principles of corporate social responsibility. Now, if you're taking the kind of approach that we're talking about, you turn that into a concrete obligation. So it's that kind of thing. So it actually means something. So you don't get the benefits unless you do it properly.
We've got to the end of our time, and we could continue for a long time, and part of what we wanted to do here was actually start these conversations so that we can explore those and other questions that people haven't asked yet as part of turning the tide. Because there are no other spaces really in which these dialogues are taking place, and in particular in which tangata whenua and te tiriti are kind of a principled foundation into which other discussions are integrated as well. And so we're never going to have enough time to explore the things that we want to here, but please join me in thanking our wahine toa.